Once upon a time.
Do you remember those forgotten TV spin-offs? The ones you grew up with but somehow left behind? In the 1970s, these shows filled our living rooms, shaping quiet moments between dinner and bedtime. How did something so familiar fade without us even realizing it? Do you remember that one landlord couple who never knew when to knock? The ones with the squawks, the snark, and the sense of timing that somehow always made you laugh, even if you didn't know why? That was Stanley and Helen Roper. And for a hot minute, and I do mean minute, they had their own show. The Ropers came straight out of Three's Company. And if you were watching TV in the late 1970s, chances are you caught at least a few episodes without realizing it was anything new. Now let's be honest here. These two didn't exactly scream leading characters. They were nosy, moody, married forever, and made complaining into a kind of Olympic sport. But that was kind of the magic. Everyone knew a couple like that. And when Three's Company decided it was time for them to move out of the apartment building and into their own show in 1979, it felt like one of those "sure, why not" ideas that somehow made it to air. So, what exactly was The Ropers? Well, picture this. Stanley and Helen pack up their endless arguments and take their chaos to a fancy new townhouse in a snooty California suburb. Immediately, they're out of place, and everyone knows it. Stanley's as tight with money as ever, and Helen's still dreaming of a life that's way more glamorous than her husband is willing to provide. If you ever felt like your parents were trapped in a sitcom and couldn't find the exit, this show was basically that. What made the show so lovable, or at least familiar, was that it never stopped being about the little things. The dinner conversations that turned into debates, the neighbors who stared too long, the phone that never stopped ringing at the worst possible time. And while it only lasted 2 seasons, those reruns stuck around long enough for it to feel like background noise in a lot of households. Even if you didn't know it by name, you knew that voice. You knew that hair. You knew those fights. And then, like a whisper in the wind, it was gone. The Ropers didn't get the same love their old neighbors did. No big finale, no farewell tour. Just a slow fade back into syndication history. But if you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you watched The Ropers without even realizing it was a spin-off or realizing that it was gone. Shows like that sneak up on you. Not because they were the biggest or the loudest, but because they were there, right there, in the next room, on the little TV with the wobbly antenna, the one you used to watch when your parents said it was too late for cartoons but not late enough for bed. It was never anyone's favorite, but somehow it ended up in all the memories anyway. Now let's talk about Flo, and if that name rings a bell, it should, especially if you ever heard the phrase "kiss my grits" yelled across a diner with just the right kind of sass. Flo was a waitress, not just any waitress, the kind of Southern Spitfire who could pour your coffee, insult your tie, and make you love her all in the same breath. She was the breakout star of Alice, but in 1980, she spun off into her own show. So here's the thing. You might think Flo was all about laughs and lipstick, and you'd be mostly right. But the show had a kind of emotional honesty too. It picked up with Flo leaving her job at Mel's Diner and heading back home to Texas. Not to settle down, oh no, but to try her hand at running a roadhouse. That's right. Flo wanted to own a bar, and that meant small-town gossip, weird customers, and enough fried food to give your memory indigestion. If Alice was a show about surviving the workday, Flo was about starting over, and that hit home for a lot of people watching in 1980. Whether you were changing jobs, moving cities, or just dreaming of what it would be like to do something bold, Flo made it feel possible. She wore big hair, big earrings, and even bigger dreams, and she never once apologized for any of it. The funny thing about Flo is how normal it was. There wasn't much flash, no wild set pieces or fancy gimmicks. It was just her and a small cast of characters who came and went through the swinging doors of that roadhouse. You had the cranky bartender, the best friend with bad ideas, and a rotating list of oddball locals who always seemed one step away from trouble. but every week Flo anchored it with that charm that made her unforgettable. Or at least, you thought she was unforgettable. The show only ran for one full season and a little change, barely enough time to build a solid rerun cycle. And that's probably why it slipped from the spotlight so quickly. Flo's voice was everywhere for a while. Her catchphrases were printed on t-shirts. But time moved fast, and by the mid-1980s, it was like she had vanished into thin air. But that's what makes this memory so strange, because if you were a kid back then, or even a teenager curled up on the couch with a snack, chances are you watched Flo. You saw the neon sign. You heard the country music theme song, and you felt the weird comfort of knowing someone was out there living loud, even when life got quiet. That was Flo. She wasn't perfect, but she made you smile. And maybe, just maybe, she made you a little braver too. Do you remember Tabitha? You might not think so right away, but if you ever watched Bewitched as a kid, there's a pretty good chance you crossed paths with this strange little show. Tabitha Stevens was Samantha's daughter. You know, the one with the twitchy nose and magic in her blood? Well, in 1977, she got her own series. All grown up, living in Los Angeles, and trying to balance a job in television while still figuring out how to control her powers. Let's just say the struggle was real and slightly sparkly. Tabitha was one of those shows that felt like a familiar bedtime story with the pages out of order. It came nearly 5 years after Bewitched had ended, but it didn't skip a beat in diving back into the same kind of magical mishaps and domestic chaos. Only this time, it was the daughter in the driver's seat. Lisa Hartman played Tabitha, and she brought this wide-eyed charm to the role, like she knew the whole thing was ridiculous but was willing to roll with it anyway. There was a brother named Adam, who, depending on who you ask, was either mortal or magical or something in between, and an aunt who felt suspiciously like a younger version of Endora. It was all there. The spells, the sparkles, the weird, unexplained sound effects whenever someone zapped in or out of a room. But even with all the ingredients, something about Tabitha just never stuck the way Bewitched did. And maybe that's why it feels like something you dreamed up. You remember the commercials. You swear you saw it. But you cannot, for the life of you, remember what happened in a single episode. That's the thing about late 1970s television. Shows didn't need 100 episodes to feel like part of your routine. Sometimes all it took was one season, a catchy theme song, and the memory of your mom folding laundry while it played in the background. Still, there was something sweet about Tabitha. The optimism, the color palette, the slightly offbeat humor that made it feel like it was stuck between the grooviness of the 70s and the wholesomeness of the 60s. It was trying to grow up, just like its lead character. And that gave it a kind of quiet charm. But charm doesn't always keep a show on the air. Ratings slipped, critics shrugged. And after just 11 episodes, Tabitha zapped herself off the network schedule for good. No big finale, no magical closure. Just a quiet little exit from a show that had already outlived its era. And yet, she stuck with us, didn't she? Not because she made waves, but because she reminded us of something softer, something simpler. A time when magic didn't have to be flashy. It just had to feel like home. Let's shift gears now. From magic spells to worn-down shoes and badge numbers. If Tabitha was all glitter and winks, Fish was cigarettes and second chances. You probably remember Detective Phil Fish from Barney Miller. He was the guy who always looked like he was 2 minutes away from retirement, or a nap. Played by Abe Vigoda with that eternal look of world weariness, Fish was the kind of character who didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. So when Barney Miller gave him his own show in 1977, it felt oddly comforting. But instead of sticking to the usual cop drama formula, Fish took a hard left turn. The show wasn't really about crime, it was about family, kind of. It followed Fish and his wife Bernice as they opened their home to a group of foster kids from all walks of life. Picture a crusty old detective surrounded by teens who had been through way too much for their age, Now picture trying to make dinner for all of them. The result was a strange but heartfelt mix of sitcom and drama, the kind of show where jokes landed next to social commentary. One minute you'd be laughing at fish struggling to fix a leaky faucet, and the next you'd be watching a teenager have a full-blown crisis over something no sitcom had really tackled before. It wasn't afraid to get heavy, but it never lost that dry, deadpan humor that Abe Vigoda did so well. Fish was a show about second lives, not just for the kids, but for the adults too. Fish himself was trying to figure out what life meant without the badge. Bernice, always fluttery and sweet, was learning how to be a mother in a way she hadn't expected. And the kids, well, they were just trying to survive and trust again, which, if you think about it, is what a lot of families were doing in the late 1970s. But here's the thing, Fish was never a flashy show. It was quiet, kind of slow. It felt more like real life than television, which is probably why it didn't last too long. 2 seasons, 35 episodes, and just like that, it was gone. Not canceled with drama, not mourned with tribute specials, just off the air. And yet ask anyone who watched Barney Miller and they'll remember Fish. They'll remember that sigh, that slump, that perfect moment of silence before the punchline. He wasn't the hero. He wasn't trying to be. But for a short time, in a little corner of network television, he was the heart of something real. Sometimes the most honest shows are the ones that whisper instead of shout. Fish never begged for attention. It just told the truth. And if you grew up with it, chances are you still remember how it felt. If you remember Sanford and Son, then you probably remember Grady, the slow-moving, slightly confused, but totally lovable friend of Fred Sanford. Always shuffling around with a blank stare and a delayed punchline, Grady was the kind of character who felt like someone's real-life uncle. You never quite knew what he was talking about, but somehow, it made sense anyway. In 1975, NBC gave him his own show. That's right, Grady stepped out of Watts and into a whole new world, and the result was exactly the kind of fish-out-of-water comedy that only the 1970s could pull off. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Instead of sticking with junkyards and back and forths with Fred, Grady moved the character to Los Angeles to live with his daughter and her family. It was a change in scenery, and also in tone. Suddenly, this man who had spent most of his screen time on Sanford and Son, making wisecracks and misunderstandings, was now trying to be a father figure, a grandpa, and maybe even a grown-up. It was a lot, and in a weird way, kind of sweet. But Grady was still Grady. He was still forgetful, still awkward, still one step behind the conversation. And that's what made the show work. At least for a little while. You got this weird blend of old-school humor and modern family life, the kind of generational clash that was becoming more common in sitcoms at the time. Grady didn't understand his son-in-law's job, or why his grandson listened to weird music, or why everyone was always in a rush, but he tried. He really did. There was a gentleness to Grady that you did not always see in spin-offs. No big gimmicks, no slapstick overload, just a man out of his element, trying to do right by his family and not totally blow it. And honestly, that kind of story hit home for a lot of viewers back then, especially those who had parents or grandparents moving in or who were dealing with the growing pains of sharing space between generations. But the thing about Grady is that it never quite found its rhythm. The laughs were there, but they were quiet. The audience wanted Fred Sanford, and what they got instead was a softer, more subdued slice of life. Only 10 episodes aired before the network pulled the plug. No send-off, no big goodbye, just another show that disappeared quietly into the television archives. Still, if you grew up watching Sanford and Son, you might remember catching an episode of Grady by accident. Maybe on a weekend rerun. Maybe during a sleepy school night when the living room TV was left on. And for a split second, you felt that little jolt of recognition. That, oh hey, it's that guy moment that only TV characters from your childhood can bring back. Shows like Grady remind us that not every spin-off needs to be a hit. Sometimes they're just a second chance for a character we already loved. A short, quiet story carved out in the middle of a busy network schedule. And if you remember it, even just the feel of it, You probably remember more than you think. Now this next one, you either remember it way too well or not at all. Jody Loves Chachi, a title so specific, so sentimental, it feels like something scribbled inside a high school notebook. And that was kind of the vibe. A spin-off of Happy Days, which was already a nostalgia trip even in its own time, this show took two of its most beloved side characters and gave them a shot at their own fairy tale ending. Sort of. So here's the deal. Chachi Arcola, played by Scott Baio, was the dreamy, slightly dim, leather jacket-wearing heartthrob that made teenage girls swoon. And Joni Cunningham, played by Erin Moran, was the girl next door with a spark. Fans of Happy Days watched them fall in love slowly, painfully, and with plenty of musical duets. It only made sense, at least on paper, to give them a spin-off. Let them have their moment. Let the kids sing. And sing they did. Jody Loves Chachi was set in Chicago, with the couple trying to make it big in the music business. Every episode had a new performance, new challenges, and a lot of googly-eyed glances across microphones. It was wholesome. Like, aggressively wholesome. So wholesome that it hurt sometimes. But that was the charm. You didn't tune in for plot twists or big stakes. You watched because you wanted to believe that these two kids could actually make it. But here's the catch. Something about it just didn't click. Maybe it was the writing. Maybe it was the music. Maybe it was the way it leaned so hard into soft romance that it forgot to be funny. Whatever the reason, audiences started checking out pretty quickly. The show only lasted one season. Barely. It was like watching a school play where everyone means well, but nobody quite knows where to stand. And yet, people remember it. Mostly with a laugh, a cringe, a shake of the head. Because Jody Loves Chachi became one of those shows that lived in the space between memory and myth. The name itself was kind of a punchline. You would hear it on sitcoms as a joke. Like, at least it's not Jody Loves Chachi. But if you grew up in the late 1970s or early 1980s, you probably saw it once. Maybe you liked it more than you'd admit. Maybe you sang along. That's the weird thing about shows like this. They weren't huge. They weren't smart. But they were there. On that little box in your living room, filling half an hour between dinner and bedtime. And for just a moment, it felt like love. Or at least, like something close enough. Phyllis Lindstrom was never the center of attention, but she made sure you never forgot she was in the room. If you watched The Mary Tyler Moore Show, then you remember Phyllis, equal parts uptight and theatrical, always floating between snobbery and total chaos. She had opinions on everything, and a tone that somehow made even compliments sound like critiques. So when she got her own show in 1975, it felt like television's version of watching the nosy neighbor finally get their day in the sun, whether anyone asked for it or not. Phyllis picked up with her life after the death of her husband, Lars, who had always been something of a running joke, often mentioned but never seen. Suddenly, a widow. Phyllis moves from Minneapolis to San Francisco with her daughter Bess, hoping for a fresh start with her in-laws. Of course, in true sitcom fashion, the fresh start turns into a complete mess. Phyllis never really knew how to not make a mess. And here's the thing. Phyllis was actually a hit at first. The character, played by Cloris Leachman, had already built up years of audience affection, or maybe mild annoyance, during her run on The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and people were curious to see what life looked like when she wasn't just barging into Mary's apartment. The show leaned into her dramatic flair and gave her plenty of space to stumble, scheme, and somehow charm her way through unfamiliar territory. She tried working in a photography studio. She got tangled in neighborhood politics. She judged everyone, of course. But at its heart, Phyllis was about trying to redefine your life when you thought it was already set in stone. That made it quietly emotional. Yes, it had the laugh tracks and the goofy misunderstandings, but there was always something deeper under the surface, especially when you remembered she was doing all this while grieving. But time is tricky on television. The momentum that came from her supporting role fame started to fade. The show changed settings after the first season, shuffled the cast around, and by the time season 2 rolled in, the spark was dimming. Viewers moved on. And just like that, Phyllis went from top 10 ratings to, wait, that got canceled? Status. What makes Phyllis so quietly important is how it fits into that bigger TV puzzle. It was part of the shared universe of The Mary Tyler Moore Show, one of the few sitcom ecosystems of its time. You had Rhoda, you had Lou Grant, and you had Phyllis, each of them branching out from the same route but landing in very different soil. You probably don't hear Phyllis quoted much today. You won't find clips of it going viral or see retrospectives on her character arc. But if you were watching television in the mid-70s, you remember her, that voice, that self-importance, that strange mix of grief and comedy. She might have faded from rerun rotation, but for a little while, Phyllis Lindstrom tried to carry a whole show on her own. And honestly, she didn't do too bad. Now let's talk about a show that had a spark of magic, literally, and still managed to vanish like a puff of smoke. The Girl with Something Extra aired from 1973 to 1974, and if that name sounds like a vague memory from a cereal commercial break, you're not alone. It starred Sally Field, fresh off her Gidget and Flying Nun fame, playing a newlywed with a very inconvenient superpower. She could read minds. Cute, right? Except not everyone wants to know what their spouse is really thinking. This show was a spiritual cousin to Bewitched, and it made no secret of it. Whimsical tone, soft lighting, comedic misunderstandings with a side of telepathy. Instead of twitching her nose or casting spells, Sally Field's character, Sally Burton, just knew what was going on in everyone's heads, which turned even the most boring dinner party into a full-blown emotional landmine. Her husband, John, played by John Davidson, loved her, but also really just wanted to have one normal conversation without getting mentally eavesdropped on. The chemistry between the leads felt genuine, and that gave the show a lightness that was easy to fall into, even if just for half an hour. Sally Field brought warmth and comic timing that made even the strangest scenes feel grounded in something human. The show played with the idea of privacy in relationships. How much do you really want your partner to know about your thoughts? It was silly, sure, but it also nudged at deeper questions with a wink and a smile. The premise was pure sitcom gold. Imagine trying to keep a surprise anniversary party secret when your wife literally hears you thinking about cake, or going on a double date with friends and realizing one of them secretly hates your outfit. That was the heart of the show. Awkward truths, uncovered feelings, and the comedy of knowing too much. And with Sally Field at the helm, bubbly, charming, and completely believable as a woman navigating love with a telepathic twist, it felt like the kind of light, quirky show that could last forever. But it didn't. In fact, it barely lasted at all. Just one season, 22 episodes. And then, nothing. No syndication, no major reruns, just a few whispers in old TV guides and a spot in Sally Field's resume that almost no one remembers. So, why did it disappear? Some say it was timing. The early 1970s were moving toward grittier, more grounded storytelling, and The Girl with Something Extra might have felt a little too fluffy for the moment. Others point to the competition. It was up against heavy hitters in its time slot. And then there's the fact that Magical Housewives were kind of a trend already played out by then. Even Bewitched was winding down. But what makes this show worth remembering is how earnestly it tried to bring back that sense of playful wonder. It asked questions like, what if love meant total honesty, even the thoughts you never say out loud? And it wrapped those questions in laughter, soft music, and the occasional nose crinkle from Sally Field. You probably forgot it existed, or maybe you caught a rerun at your grandmother's house and thought you dreamed it. But for just a little while, The Girl with Something Extra gave us one more magical woman, trying to live a normal life in a world that never quite lets her. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? If you grew up on the Waltons, then you already know the kind of soft-spoken, homespun warmth that Apple's Way was aiming for. Only this time, instead of red dirt roads and Depression-era mountain towns, you got a paved driveway in Iowa and a house full of people trying to hold on to their values in a world moving way too fast. Apple's Way aired in 1974 and was gone by 1975, but for that brief moment, it carved out a space for something surprisingly rare on television: quiet, sincere optimism. The premise was simple. George Apple, an architect from Los Angeles, decides to move his family back to his hometown of Appleton, Iowa. The move is meant to be a return to roots, a rejection of city life in favor of small-town values, wide-open skies, and slower days. So the Apples, George, his wife Barbara, and their 4 children pack it all up and try to start fresh. But of course, starting fresh never comes without complications. The show leaned hard into the culture clash between past and present. George had been away for a long time, and the town had changed just enough to feel unfamiliar. His children, raised in the city, didn't quite fit the mold of rural community life. And yet, instead of turning that discomfort into slapstick or melodrama, Apple's Way treated it with respect. Every episode was a kind of emotional balancing act, showing the tension between tradition and progress, family and individuality, right and wrong. It was one of the few shows on air that trusted its audience to sit with a quiet moment and let it breathe. Characters listened to each other, and the show gave space for that. Not everything had to be solved in 22 minutes. The music was gentle, the lighting warm, and even the silences felt like part of the dialogue. For families watching together, it felt less like TV and more like a conversation they might actually have at the dinner table. That tone came straight from its creators, the same folks behind the Waltons, who knew how to take the little problems of daily life and make them feel big, important, and full of heart. Episodes dealt with issues like racism, censorship, environmental concerns, and generational misunderstandings, not in an after-school special kind of way, but through the everyday lives of people just trying to figure it out. Nothing was ever too loud. Nobody was ever too mean, and somehow that made it feel more real. Just a family, trying to be a family. And maybe that is why the show quietly vanished. Not because it wasn't good, but because it was too gentle for prime time. In the mid-1970s, television was shifting. Sitcoms were getting sharper, dramas were getting darker, and Apple's Way, with its sincere smiles and thoughtful dinners, just felt out of step. Still, the show had its fans. And if you were one of them, you probably remember the feeling it gave you. That rare calm that came from watching a show where no one was perfect, but everyone was trying. You might remember the open fields, the porch lights, the sound of the screen door swinging shut. Maybe you watched it with your family on a Sunday night. Maybe it was just a rerun that stuck with you. But the truth is, Apple's Way wasn't really about the plot. It was about the feeling, the longing, the idea that maybe, just maybe, life could slow down long enough for us to catch our breath. There's a reason it faded, but there's also a reason we're still talking about it, even just a little. Because shows like this, the ones built from quiet hope and gentle honesty, never completely go away. If you only knew Lou Grant from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, then you probably remember him as the gruff but lovable boss with a soft center buried under all that sarcasm. A walking contradiction. All bark, very little bite, but somehow always the grown-up in the room. So imagine the surprise when, in 1977, Lou got his own show. And it was not a comedy. Not even close. Lou Grant was a drama, a real one, about newspapers, truth, corruption, and the moral weight of storytelling. And for 5 full seasons, it delivered some of the sharpest, most grown-up television of its time. The setup was simple, but the tone was a complete departure. After leaving Minneapolis and television news behind, Lou moves to Los Angeles to become the city editor of the fictional Los Angeles Tribune. There, he joins a team of reporters, photographers, and editors, all working against deadlines and red tape to uncover stories that mattered. And suddenly, the character who used to throw punchlines at Mary Richards was knee-deep in real-world problems like police brutality, environmental scandals, political cover-ups, and journalistic ethics. The transition was jarring, but in the best way. Because it worked. Lou was still Lou, just in a world that took him more seriously. Ed Asner gave the performance of his life, anchoring the show with this incredible mix of warmth, authority, and weariness. He didn't lecture. He didn't preach. He just asked hard questions, took long pauses, and made you feel like maybe, just maybe, The truth was worth chasing, and Lou Grant chased it. Every episode was a window into the newsroom, showing not just the headlines but the process behind them. The debates, the phone calls, the rewrites. It respected journalism in a way most shows never even try to. It made the audience care about fact-checking. It made you feel like a typed paragraph could change a city. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when trust in media was complicated and politics were messy, that kind of storytelling felt brave. The show won awards, tons of them. 29 Emmy nominations, 13 wins. Critics adored it. It ran for 5 seasons, 114 episodes. That is a serious legacy. But somewhere along the way, it slipped out of the public conversation. Maybe because it was too serious. Maybe because television got louder and faster. Or maybe because Lou Grant, as a character, belonged to an era when newsrooms had more weight and fewer gimmicks. This wasn't just a spin-off, it was a transformation, a quiet, confident reminder that television could be smart without being smug, that a character could grow up, and so could the audience. Lou Grant wasn't loud, but it never whispered. It spoke clearly, plainly, and with just enough gravel in its voice to let you know it meant business. And that's why it matters, even if you forgot about it. Because in a world full of noise, Lou Grant was one of the rare shows that actually had something to say. If you ever wanted a show that felt like someone dumped comic books, neon, and science experiments into a blender and hit maximum weird, then Misfits of Science was exactly that. This was not just a sitcom, it was a full-on, off-the-rails superhero show disguised as a comedy. And it wore its chaos proudly. You had a cast of characters with mutant powers, a government lab gone rogue, and enough 1980s synth music to short-circuit a Walkman. It was like someone tried to make a live-action cartoon using only spare parts from other genres. The show had the energy of a rock concert at a science fair, and the characters felt like your coolest weird friends from homeroom. It did not just break the mold, it tripped over it, zapped it with lightning, and made a joke about it. The team? Absolute misfits. There was a guy who could shoot lightning from his hands, another who could shrink down to the size of a soda can, and a telekinetic teen girl who constantly reminded you she was not here for your nonsense. And then there was the lead scientist, basically the human equivalent of a confused lab coat, trying to keep the whole group together. These were not polished heroes. These were weird, rebellious, emotionally chaotic outcasts. And that was the point. Every episode was a grab bag of madcap adventures. Government chases, exploding gadgets, mind control, time warps. It was all fair game. The tone shifted constantly. One minute you were watching a goofy car chase with banana peels, and the next, you were knee-deep in existential questions about identity and power. That is what made it so fascinating for kids. You could laugh at the goofy action, but still feel like you were watching something just a little bit dangerous, a little bit different, and it never really slowed down. The pacing was like a sugar rush, fast, frantic, and just on the edge of losing control. The visual effects were, well, they tried. Lots of glowing lights, off-screen sound effects, and actors squinting really hard to imply psychic strain. But honestly, that only added to the charm. You did not need it to look real. You just needed it to feel fun. And Misfits of Science delivered fun in wild, messy waves. What really set it apart, though, was the attitude. This was a show that knew it was weird. It leaned into the absurdity, laughed at itself, and gave 1980s kids something they had never seen before. A world where being strange was a strength, not a flaw. It said, you do not have to be a perfect superhero. You just have to be you. Weird powers, messy emotions, and all. And for a generation that grew up feeling like outsiders, that message landed hard. Even though it only lasted 1 season, Misfits of Science built a quiet legacy. It was the weird show you bragged about remembering, the one that made you feel like science could be chaotic, hilarious, and kind of awesome. And the best part? It made being a misfit look pretty heroic. You're under arrest, sugar. That was the catchphrase that made America sit up and take notice, if only briefly. Get Christy Love was revolutionary in its time, featuring one of television's first black female leads in a crime drama. Teresa Graves starred as Christy Love, an undercover detective in a world that was still figuring out how to talk about race, power, and gender. She was smart, tough, stylish, and unforgettable. The show was based loosely on a made-for-television movie, which drew major buzz. ABC thought they had the next big hit on their hands, and for a moment, it seemed like they did. But then the cracks began to show. The scripts were formulaic, the action routine, and the production values limited. Christy Love was meant to be bold, but the stories rarely let her break out of tired cliches. Behind the scenes, Graves, who had converted to a religious faith, refused to participate in any scenes she felt were too violent or provocative. Creative clashes followed. The network struggled to find the right tone. Ratings dipped, and by the end of its first season, the show was gone. What should have been a trailblazer was reduced to a footnote. Still, Christy Love carved out a place in history. She opened a door that had been shut for too long, even if she did not get to walk all the way through it. Today, she is remembered more for what she represented than for the plots she solved. A symbol of potential unrealized, a legend born from a show that never had the chance to grow. The 20th Century Fox Hour was a short-lived attempt to bridge the golden age of cinema with the golden glow of television. Running from 1955 to 1957, it was an anthology series that adapted well-known films and original stories into hour-long television dramas. It was elegant, it was cinematic. It tried to carry the weight of the studio's name on its back and bring it straight into your living room. Each episode had a familiar polish to it, like watching a condensed movie but with all the grandeur still intact. Famous stories were trimmed down to fit into 60 minutes, and new dramas tried their best to live up to the brand that preceded them. Some succeeded, some did not. But even when it missed with grace. The lighting, the music, the framing, it all felt like a miniature film festival delivered to your living room. You did not watch it to laugh or relax, you watched it to watch. It reminded people that television could be art, not just noise. But every Sunday, viewers knew they were getting something a little more refined, a little more serious. In a world of variety shows and slapstick, the 20th Century Fox Hour felt like a whisper from the movie theater down the street. It was classy without being cold, dramatic without being dull. But the formula proved hard to sustain. The rise of sitcoms, westerns, and science fiction made its slower pacing feel out of step. Eventually, it quietly faded, unable to compete with the flashier new kids on the block. But it left behind a strange elegance, a kind of dignity that other shows rarely aimed for. Some shows are just too weird and wonderful to survive. The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. was one of them. Imagine a show that mixed cowboy shootouts with futuristic science fiction, where a Harvard-educated bounty hunter rode horseback through the Wild West chasing outlaws and ancient alien technology. It should not have worked, but somehow it did. Bruce Campbell's Brisco was charming, sharp, and oddly philosophical for a man in spurs. The tone was part Western, part comic book, and part pulp serial, and all heart. It winked at the camera, but never lost its soul. There were glowing orbs, steampunk gadgets, and a subplot about time-traveling artifacts that felt wildly out of place, and yet completely right. It was not just about justice. It was about belief. Belief in progress, in legacy, in the idea that even the Wild West had a future worth dreaming of. But television did not know what to do with it. The ratings were decent. The fan base was devoted, but it was too different, too out there. After one season, it was gone. One of the most original shows of the 1990s disappeared into the void while the world chose safer stories. Now, it lives on in whispers, on fan forums, in dusty DVD collections, in the memories of those who knew television had stumbled upon something special and let it slip away. Brisco County was ahead of its time. Maybe that was the problem. Or maybe the real adventure was just getting to see it at all. If you grew up in the 80s, the Hogan Family was the kind of show that felt like it had always been on. It started as Valerie, a family sitcom with Valerie Harper as the mom, but then it changed. She left the show. The name changed, and suddenly Sandy Duncan was the new mother figure, raising 3 boys with more heart than anyone expected. And somehow, even with that behind-the-scenes shuffle, it worked. It really worked. The Hogan family had all the ingredients of a comforting sitcom: school troubles, sibling fights, family dinners, and those quiet moments where someone finally admitted what they were really feeling. But what made it different was how grounded it felt. These were not superheroes or millionaires or time travelers. They were a regular American family trying to get through each day, and sometimes just barely doing it. You had David, the oldest, too cool for school but clearly carrying more weight than he let on. Then the twins, Mark and Willie, who were classic opposites, one responsible, one reckless. Watching them stumble through adolescence, heartbreak, and growing up felt a little too familiar for anyone who was going through the same thing at home. And that was the point. It reflected the real, even if it wrapped it all up in a neat 22 minutes. There were laughs, sure, but there were also some incredibly emotional moments. The kind where someone breaks down in the kitchen or says something quiet right before walking out the door. Those moments stuck. You might not remember the episode titles or the air dates, but you remember the feeling of watching a family work through something hard and come out stronger. The Hogan Family was one of those shows that stayed under the radar, never as flashy as some others, but if you grew up with it, you felt like you really knew them. Like they were neighbors. Like they were friends. And now, decades later, maybe it is time to knock on that door again and see how much of that world you still carry with you. Out of This World was the kind of show that made you look at your bedroom light switch and wonder if it could stop time. The premise was totally unhinged in the best possible way. A teenage girl named Evie finds out on her 13th birthday that her dad is an alien, her mom is a regular human, and she now has powers because of their interplanetary love story. Her biggest power? She could press her fingers together and freeze time. Just like that. No rules, no cool-down period, just instant freeze like she was microwaving the world. And that was just episode 1. The show did not even try to be subtle about how weird it was. Evie's alien father, who we never actually saw on screen, would talk to her through a glowing cube on her nightstand. Not a phone, not a space hologram. A cube. It lit up, pulsed with celestial wisdom, and occasionally gave fatherly advice in a James Earl Jones-type voice. Imagine doing your homework while your space dad lectures you from a glowing cube about honesty and Saturn. That was normal for her. And the tone? It wobbled between coming-of-age sitcom and low-budget science fiction with zero shame. One scene would be your typical teen drama, Evie trying to fit in at school or crushing on a boy, and the next scene she would freeze the entire cafeteria and change all the grades, or fast-forward through gym class, or rewind conversations. That was the real fantasy. Not just time travel, but time editing, like if life had a DVR remote and you were in charge of rewrites. That idea alone stuck in every 1980s kid's head. Of course, she was constantly learning that using her powers had consequences, but the show never really explained how or why they worked, and honestly, no one asked. You just accepted that this teenage girl had cosmic powers and a space cube father and moved on. Maybe it was the times, or maybe it was because the 1980s were filled with shows that asked you to believe in the impossible, as long as it had a laugh track and neon lighting. The supporting cast made things even weirder. Her best friend was always suspicious but never quite figured it out. Her uncle was a struggling comic with bad timing and worse luck, and her mom was just cool with all of it, raising a half-alien daughter who could bend time. Sure, whatever, just get your chores done. The lack of panic was almost as strange as the premise. But that is exactly why Out of This World made such a deep mark. It told kids that maybe being weird was not a flaw. Maybe it was your superpower. Evie was not the coolest, the smartest, or the most popular, but she was different. And for every kid watching who felt out of place or misunderstood, that meant everything. The show let you laugh at the awkwardness of growing up while also pretending you could pause your homework with a finger snap. Not a bad deal, if you ask me. It had the setting, it had the potential, it even made history. The Corner Bar was a sitcom set in a modest New York watering hole, A familiar formula with a twist, it featured one of the first recurring gay characters on American television. Peter Panama, played by Vincent Schiavelli, was quietly groundbreaking. But the show around him never quite matched the boldness of that casting. Week after week, it shuffled between quirky patrons, minor hijinks, and barroom chatter that often felt more like background noise than plot. ABC hoped it would be a hit in the style of Cheers, before Cheers existed. But the writing lacked the snap. The characters blurred together. The bar, instead of feeling lived in, felt like a stage set waiting for the real show to begin. Audiences did not connect, ratings dropped, the cast changed. The show was retooled for a second season with a new owner and different characters, but it still could not find its voice. After 2 brief seasons, it disappeared with little fanfare. And yet, for that one quiet step forward in representation, it remains part of television history. Not for being great, not even for being good, but for daring, however briefly, to show someone different. The corner bar might not have lasted, but it cracked the door open. That matters, even if everything else around it faded. The Many Loves of Dobby Gillis was not your average teenage sitcom. It aired from 1959 to 1963 and had one of the most unique voices of its time. This was a show about a lovesick young man who talked directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall long before it became a storytelling trend. Dobby was charming, hopelessly romantic, and always entangled in some absurd scheme to win over the girl of the week. But what made the show stand out even more was the presence of Maynard G. Krebs, played by Bob Denver, a beatnik sidekick who recoiled at the word work and became a cultural icon in his own right. The show was funny, sharp, and smarter than it often got credit for. It touched on real themes of class, ambition, and teenage rebellion, all wrapped in a light-hearted, lovable package. Dobby wasn't a rebel or a genius. He was something rarer, a sincere dreamer. He wanted love, he wanted meaning, and he wanted it without irony. It was the first time television said it was okay to be awkward, poetic, and hopeful at once. And it let teenagers be foolish without making them the punchline. It gave American youth a voice, an oddball voice maybe, but a voice nonetheless. Over time, though, it was overtaken by louder, brighter comedies and the rise of more dramatic fare. Dobby faded into the background, his monologues forgotten, his daydreams replaced by different kinds of heroes. But if you watched it, really watched it, you remember the warmth, the honesty, the way it made being young feel both ridiculous and profound. Some shows lasted long enough to become legends. Salute Your Shorts only needed 1 season. Set in Camp Anawanna, this scrappy little series captured the chaos, laughter, and bittersweet awkwardness of summer camp better than anything before or since. It was loud, it was messy, it was perfect. Every episode was a snapshot of friendship forged in bug spray and bad cafeteria food. You had Donkey Lips, the lovable underdog; Budnick, the rule-breaking prankster with a hidden soft side; Dina, Sponge. They were not polished or pretty. They were real. Kids who wore mismatched socks, fought over bunk beds, and stayed up too late daring each other to sneak into the woods. But what made Salute Your Shorts stick was its honesty. It understood that camp is more than canoe races and ghost stories. It is where kids first learn how to be away from home, how to find your place, how to fall in and out of crushes and feel like the world is ending over a lost flashlight. It was funny, yes, but also deeply nostalgic. Even as it aired, it felt like something already gone. Maybe that is why it ended so quickly. It burned too bright. Networks wanted polish. What they got was heart. Now it survives in memory, in campfire smoke and the sound of a distant whistle, in the way the theme song still gets stuck in your head out of nowhere. For those who remember, Salute Your Shorts was more than just a show. It was a summer that never really ended. You could not watch Perfect Strangers without falling in love with Balki Bartokomous. He came from the fictional island of Mypos, wore vests over sweaters in the middle of summer, and had a heart so big it practically broke through the screen. Then there was Larry Appleton, tightly wound, neurotic, trying way too hard to keep it together in a Chicago apartment that suddenly had to accommodate a wide-eyed cousin who had never used an elevator before. It was a classic odd couple setup, but it had something deeper going on, something that stuck with you even if you forgot all the punchlines. What made Perfect Strangers work was not just the culture clash. Though, yes, there were many hilarious misunderstandings involving vacuum cleaners, pig statues, and whatever strange tradition Balky brought with him from Mypos. It was about connection. Balky and Larry were different in every way, but they were family, and they made each other better, even when Larry was losing his mind over a job interview, and Balky just wanted to dance the dance of joy. The show had heart, not the glossy, overproduced kind, but the kind that creeps up on you in a scene where one cousin messes everything up and the other forgives him anyway. It made room for silliness, like Balky trying to understand American slang, and still managed to teach a whole generation what patience, empathy, and kindness looked like between people who had no reason to get along, but did it anyway. Looking back, Perfect Strangers feels like a quiet rebellion against cynicism. It told you that the world might be confusing and complicated, but a little laughter and a lot of compassion could carry you through. It reminded kids who felt like outsiders that being different was not just okay. It was wonderful. It was joyful. It was worth dancing for. You probably forgot how good it felt to watch these two figure things out together. Maybe you did not remember the names. Maybe you forgot the storylines. But if you ever laughed when someone yelled, "Don't be ridiculous," then it is already part of you. And maybe that is what we all need again. Something silly, sincere, and just strange enough to feel like home. Then there was ALF, short for Alien Life Form. Yes, the show really named itself that. And yes, it somehow became one of the most beloved sitcoms of the late 1980s. Alf was a furry, sarcastic alien from the planet Melmac who crash-landed into a suburban family's garage and basically refused to leave. He looked like a cross between a teddy bear and a rug, had the voice of a Vegas lounge act, and spent half the show trying to eat the family cat. If that doesn't scream weird, I don't know what does. This was not your usual sitcom setup. The Tanners, an average American family, took ALF in without much hesitation. One day, no alien. The next, a wisecracking extraterrestrial is living in the laundry room and hogging the telephone. And the government? Nowhere to be found. The family had to hide him from the outside world, which led to all kinds of classic sitcom hijinks, but with a sci-fi twist. It was like E.T. if E.T. had a Brooklyn accent and a better stand-up routine. Alf was pure chaos. He would mess with the neighbors, destroy appliances, flirt with the mother, and deliver one-liners faster than you could finish your dinner. His humor was weirdly adult, full of sarcasm, dry wit, and bizarre cultural references. But kids still loved him. Maybe because he looked like something out of a toy aisle. Or maybe because he was the one character who never took anything seriously. He was rude, messy, and unapologetically loud. Everything you could never get away with at the dinner table. What made ALF stand out from the rest was its tone. It bounced between slapstick comedy and emotional depth with zero warning. One moment, Alf is dancing in the kitchen. The next, he's talking about the destruction of his home planet and the loss of his loved ones. For a show about a talking alien, it sure got heavy sometimes. And that hit 1980s kids differently. It gave you permission to laugh, but also to feel a little weird about why you were laughing. The set design and puppetry only made things stranger. Alf was a full-sized puppet operated by multiple people, and you could feel that tension. The show had to build trapdoors and raised platforms just to make it work. The puppeteer Paul Fusco also voiced ALF, and sometimes you could tell. The energy felt half scripted, half unhinged. But that was part of the magic. ALF didn't move like anything human, and that added a layer of eerie realism to an already bonkers premise. As the seasons went on, the show started getting darker. ALF's longing for home became more pronounced. The humor got weirder. The stakes felt higher. And when the series ended, with ALF captured by the government, It left a scar on every 1980s kid who ever believed aliens could be funny. The final note was not a laugh, but a question. What happens when your strange, fuzzy house guest gets taken away and never comes back? That was ALF in a nutshell. Part sitcom, part existential comedy, part alien fever dream that somehow felt totally normal on a Thursday night. It was a sitcom with bark, but no bite. McGurk. A Dog's Life featured actors in full-body dog costumes, playing a family of suburban canines navigating everyday problems like job interviews, neighborhood feuds, and raising puppies. Yes, really. It sounds like a bizarre fever dream, and watching it felt even stranger. The actors, muffled by their rubber dog heads, delivered dialogue through stiff movements and awkward lip-syncing. The humor relied on canine puns and human situations made weirder by the fact that everyone was dressed like a golden retriever. The show's premise was never fully explained. Were these dogs living in a world of humans? Were they symbolic? Satirical? No one knew, and that uncertainty made it nearly impossible for viewers to connect. Audiences were bewildered, critics were harsh, even kids, who were assumed to be the target audience, seemed more confused than entertained. NBC hoped it would be a quirky, family-friendly hit, but McGurk stumbled out of the gate. The novelty wore off fast. Once you got past the initial shock of talking dogs in business suits, there was not much left. No sharp writing, no emotional core, just a lot of wagging tails and sitcom tropes buried in fur. The show lasted only a handful of episodes before being quietly retired. Few mourned its passing. But in its own strange way, McGurk has become a cult legend. Proof that in the 1970s, networks were willing to try anything, even a dog suit sitcom. Today, it stands as one of the oddest experiments to ever grace prime time. A surreal reminder that television's strangest ideas sometimes make it all the way to air. The Colgate Comedy Hour was not just another variety show, it was an event. Airing live from 1950 to 1955, it brought the electric chaos of the stage directly into the homes of millions. Hosted by a rotating cast of comedy legends like Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Eddie Cantor, and Abbott and Costello, the show captured a kind of energy that no scripted sitcom ever could. It was unpredictable, unpolished, and wildly entertaining. Every week was a gamble, a new experiment in whether or not the comedians could top their last performance. And more often than not, they did. It was a golden age of television in the raw, where mistakes happened on air and the audience loved it more for that. You felt the tension in every live performance. Anything could go wrong, and sometimes it did. But that chaos made it human, alive, and impossible to turn away from. It was the only place where you could see slapstick, song, and celebrity all within the same breath. And at its best, it felt like the whole country was in on the joke at the same time. The competition with The Ed Sullivan Show was fierce, and at times it looked like Colgate might actually win. But time plays favorites, and while Ed Sullivan became immortal, Colgate Comedy Hour became something else, a memory. It disappeared almost as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving only clips and scattered references behind. Yet for those who watched it, those Sunday nights were unforgettable. You did not just laugh, you roared. You shouted across the room. You felt alive. It was theater, comedy, and chaos wrapped into 1 hour of brilliance. There was something strange and beautiful about this show, like a bedtime story wrapped in a sitcom. Nanny and the Professor was about a mysterious English nanny named Phoebe Figolilli, who arrived out of nowhere to care for the chaotic household of Professor Everett and his 3 kids. She had an air of magic about her, never overt, never explained, but always understood. This was not a flashy show. There were no laugh tracks forcing you to find it funny, no obvious special effects screaming for attention. Instead, it asked you to believe, to trust that sometimes the people who save us do not come with explanations. They just show up quietly, like Nanny did, and make life a little better without asking for anything in return. There were whispers that she was psychic. Some thought she was a witch. But it never mattered. What mattered was that she taught 3 kids and a tired, widowed professor how to feel joy again. And for a brief moment in television history, that kind of emotional rescue was enough. When the show ended after just 2 seasons, it left behind a strange sense of unresolved wonder. We never found out who Nanny really was. Maybe that was the point. Some people are not meant to stay. They just pass through when you need them most. Like a childhood memory you can almost remember, but not quite. If any of these forgotten shows made you smile, wince, or suddenly remember your old living room couch, tell us which one hit hardest in the comments. And if you want more cozy TV trips like this, give us a like and subscribe so you don't miss a thing.